3. And of course, the context is rebuilding the walls. And the thought that came to my mind was after certainly that appointment with the king and how God would use the king to supply Nehemiah with those things he needed, including an endorsement, thereby really forcing the resident governors to allow Nehemiah to do the things that God had purposed in his heart. And the thought that came to my mind as I was sitting there, as we're going to look at the entire chapter 3 tonight, which is 32 verses, and I believe we can do it, is I remember the way he confronted the residents. And again, it's hard to glean the tone, although I think certainly as we understand the context and really the state of the rubble and the disheartening that took place, I think we can imagine the way he would have counseled them. And I remember thinking that he sort of quarantined them and he said, surely you have seen. Surely the heartbreak that I'm experiencing must be your plight too. I cannot be the only Jew who's upset that our walls have been destroyed. Surely I cannot be the only patriot around. And I remember thinking sort of his rhetorical question was, surely you have seen, surely your heart must be broken, and yet you've done nothing about it. And yet you've done nothing about it. And it seems like one of the things that God keeps impressing upon my heart is the duty that we are commanded. We are co-laborers. Again, we saw this on Sunday as we looked at Philip continuing the work that Christ had begun in Samaria. That we are the earthen vessels that have this treasure. And we are called to cooperate and to co-labor with the Lord. It is us. Certainly it is the divine work of grace, and yet there is a human element. We have a part to play too. Again, that's the beauty. A lot of times I've described it as cooperating. God simply wants you to cooperate. And yet I think when you have the right heart, it's this participation that's based upon love. Because Paul said something like this: either do it because you love it, or do it out of a sense of duty. And I really think that was probably the language he was speaking there to the recipients of that particular letter. But I think of Nehemiah's tone. But after he certainly probably posted them up, he would follow that with an exhortation that would encourage them. Because what we saw was, and we didn't see this, again, this is where we would speculate. Did they deliberate for a long time? Or was their hearts already prepared and they were anticipating that God would send someone? You know, one of the things I love about my experience here is how often people pull me aside over the last 3 years and tell me how long they've been praying for a Bible teaching church. You know, and now that it's here, to see them rejoicing, and I wonder if their hearts weren't ready, because what we saw was sort of an immediate response. There didn't appear to be a delay. And they would basically say, yes, let us build. And then they would build based upon the plans that Nehemiah would set forward. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. Now, when we look at Nehemiah chapter 3, we need to understand, based on the things we saw in the last 2 chapters, that the conditions are very adverse. If you'll recall, and I sort of did a play on words, that when he went out to inspect or survey the land, he did it at night. And certainly he came back and would assess it as being a nightmare, because he went out at night. Nightmare. Man. Maybe I should rehearse the punchlines. I don't know. But we would know that there certainly would be this intense resident opposition. But what we would also know, based upon the way God would anoint Nehemiah, there would be a unique and very unusual organization. We're going to discover tonight that he will give out specific delegations. Again, different people will be given over specific tasks, responsibilities, and therefore opportunities to invest. Opportunities to invest. I know one of the things I gleaned from my pastoral role is to always have an eye to invest. Invest, Timmy. You can't, what did he say? He said, you can't take it with you, but you can certainly send it ahead. And I've been all about sending it ahead. I've been all about sending it ahead. Again, these are things he taught me. Tonight we're going to see as the Jews would come together, there's very much this unified workforce. They're going to co-labor with one another. There will be this co-laborative type of effort. Again, the same spirit, the same attitude. But what else we're going to notice too about Nehemiah is that he will employ practicality and common sense. Nehemiah will make the building of the walls very simple. And I think part of the reason we're going to glean this tonight based upon the time constraints, he doesn't have a whole lot of time to waste. Again, this theme of no convenience. Again, work smart. We're also going to see that the way he assigns these tasks is going to allow the people, it's actually going to cause the people to be greatly motivated based upon the consequences. And that'll make more sense once you read through. We're also going to see that he will assign people and allow them to use their specialized vocational skills. Yeah. It's like, dude, if you can type, I'm putting you at the keyboard type of thing. Right? Basic things. But we're going to see that he's going to function as sort of a job site superintendent and within this very complex job site. And again, this will make sense to some of you, man, and it certainly does to me because I spent 10 years on a job site there in a trailer. You know, we had to mobilize another construction term. But we're going to see that there were 42 sections of different areas that needed to be worked. We're also going to discover that, well, one of the things, and I thought this was interesting, is that Ezra and the city of Bethlehem are left off the list. Now, here's the theme of tonight. When it comes to building the walls, it will be laborious. It will be good old-fashioned hard work. We're going to discover that there will be no striving and they will be unified in their efforts. Listen to Proverbs 12, verse 24. The hand of the diligent will rule, while the slothful will be put to forced labor. Again, throughout the scriptures, we sort of see this theme that God calls us to this diligent effort. Proverbs 14:23 says this, in all toil there is profit, but mere talk tends or leads only to poverty. To poverty, right? Ephesians, and there are tons of verses. These were just some that I really like tonight. Ephesians 4, verse 28 says, let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. Again, listening just to these few verses, my cry for us tonight as a body would be, Lord, stir our hearts. As he would do this building here at Calvary Chapel, may there be no disputes, may there be no worldly distractions. May we too, like the workforce under Nehemiah, be focused and committed. It needs to be a priority. It certainly is a priority of my house. Nehemiah chapter 3, we're going to begin in verse 1, and we're going to try to do 32. We'll see what happens. And no giggling. Oh, so you've read ahead. No giggling. Bear with me. Then Eliashib, the high priest, rose up with his brethren, the priests, and they built the sheep gate. So what we see here is the son of Joachim, which we find in Nehemiah 12 and Ezra 10, that he begins to set sort of this example and the precedent. Notice it's the high priest who begins the work. Again, even as the senior pastor, I am not exempt from working hard. Saturday mornings, we were discussing that. Well, actually, we're going to step into that probably this Saturday in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17, where it says that he who labors hard, especially in the teaching and the preaching of the word, he is worthy of double honor. And here we see that the high priest is setting a precedent and an example by rolling up his sleeves and working with his brethren. But what I love is the assignment that Nehemiah gave to the high priest and to the priest there, the sheep gate. Now the sheep gate we know from John chapter 5, it's near the pool of Bethsaida. But this would have been the area where the sheep or the animal sacrifices would have been brought to market. It would have been the way any sacrifice entered the city of Jerusalem. Any sacrifice that would enter the city of Jerusalem. Now, when I hear those terms set out, verbally, I think of John chapter 1, verse 29. And this would be when John the Baptist was baptizing in the Jordan River. As he would see Jesus at the shore, he would exclaim and cry out, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." The day that he was sacrificed, he too would have had to enter in through the sheep gate. All sacrifices enter into the city of Jerusalem through the sheep gate. We are not getting through 32 verses tonight. No way. That's not even the first verse. But look what happens next. And I didn't think there was too much in this. And I spent days laboring over it and more as I'm pulling out, which seems like just an arbitrary, well, I don't want to say arbitrary, but maybe for us an irrelevant list of names that may not seem to mean much to our lives today, although certainly to the Jews it meant a lot. But here we see the priest and the high priest, and again now they would build the sheep gate. Well, here's what I love. It says they consecrated it and they hung its doors. So here they would give it that proper designation and use. Again, what we would see is that they sort of performed this dedication ceremony. They would bless it and they would sanctify it. Nothing else but sacrifices were allowed to enter in through the sheep gate. Again, here we would see that the sheep gate would be given over for the Lord's use only. I want to be the sheep gate. I don't want to have anyone else's hand up my shirt and treating me like a puppet but the Lord. I want to be His alone. Again, one of the definitions I've been learning of worship is that we give ourselves over to the Lord. Right? Because we've certainly given ourselves over to so many other things. And like the sheep gate, might we be consecrated and have our doors hung. Now what's cool is as we cruise through it, I used to work in the structural steel industry. So for me it sounds a lot like these guys were iron workers because of the terms that they're using. But it says there they built as far as the Tower of 100. Now we don't really know exactly what that 100 means. It was somewhat uncertain, although we would assume that it would be an attribute of its designation. And it too, this Tower of 100, would be consecrated then as far as the Tower of Hananel, which is interesting about this. We know that this tower is mentioned by Jeremiah in chapter 31 and Zechariah 14. We studied that. But these towers would move west about 150 yards. So the priest would, for you guys, it would be the sheep gate, and then moving west 150 yards would have been their area of responsibility. This was their area per Nehemiah, verse 2. And then next to them would have been Eliashib, the men of Jericho. Now what's interesting about this city, it's about 20 miles northeast. And then next to them would be Sioux, the son of Imri, built. So here what we see is Zacchur, which is interesting because it's sort of like a short form of Zechariah. So instead of calling me Timothy, a lot of you just call me Tim or Timmy, whatever. Same for Zacchur. But what's interesting about him is when we look forward to Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 12, we're going to discover that he was one of the Levites who would sign the covenant that Nehemiah would proclaim. And we're going to get into that when we get to Nehemiah chapter 10. And then it says there in verse 3, also the sons of Hassenaah built the fish gate. Now what's interesting about the fish gate is very much within the old city, this would function as the farmer's market. The merchants from Tyre would come down and they would enter through the northern gate and they would sort of set up this fish market. And it says there that these men, or these sons of this man, they laid its beams, hung its doors with its bolts and its bars. Again, here I see the ironworkers being mentioned. Local 433 back in Southern California. Means nothing to you guys, but for me it meant a lot for a lot of years. Verse 4, and then it says, and next to them Merimoth, which is interesting because it says there that he is the son of Urijah. And we discover this in Ezra chapter 8, verse 33. And then the son of Koz, and it says that they would make repairs. Now because it's not really identified, it probably was just some basic repairs amongst the city walls. But what we're going to begin to notice about this particular boy is that this son of the priest would begin to step up and to labor. Why that means so much to me is because I too, my children are the sons and the daughters of the priest. Essentially, it's the pastor kids. It's the PKs, as we lovingly have designated them. And they're actually hustling and girding their loins and doing some work. And then it says there, and next to them was Meshulam, the son of Berechiah. And what we know about him, we mentioned this before, that someday his daughter would marry Tobiah's son. Again, one of the arch enemies of Nehemiah and the Jews. We find this in Nehemiah 6:18. And then it says, and then the son of Meshi-Ezabel made repairs. And then next to them was Zadok the son of Baanah, and he also made repairs. Again, these are names that we don't find a lot of historical record of who they are in the Scripture. So if I don't mention much, it's because not a lot was given. And the difficult thing about these names is most of these names are extremely common. You know, it would be kind of like saying, I mean, there was a time, and maybe you don't remember, but if you said Dave or David at Calvary Chapel, South Sioux City, you'd be like, well, which one? Right? And even now, Lori. There's a whole bunch of Loris, right? Only one Jeremiah. Only one Levis, right? And certainly only one Jesus for now. Right? So we don't know a lot about them, so we don't really want to surmise unless it's really been clearly recorded who they are. And then it says there in verse 5, and then next to them were the Tekoites, or the Tekoites, from the land of Tekoa. And what's interesting about this, if you read the minor prophet of Amos, this was his hometown, and it says here that these people would make repairs. Now what I love about this particular city, if you recall, reading through the year Bible, just a few, probably about a week and a half ago, you'll recall that one of, I want to say it was it Joab? Who would hire a woman of Tekoa to go and to manipulate David. You guys remember that? It was in 2 Samuel chapter 25, verse 14. But Tekoa is about 12 miles south of Jerusalem, and it would be near Bethlehem. But look what it says about the Tekoites. But their nobles did not put their shoulders to the work of their Lord. Now, for some reason, the nobles would personally remain in Tekoa. Again, these exalted ones is the definition. They would refuse to be yoked. Now, it could be something as simple as these aristocrats disdained manual labor. But ultimately, what we understand is they were not willing to do the work of the Lord. And as I thought about that today, it's certainly a great contrast to the servant king that we find in the Gospel of Mark. And his name is Jesus Christ. Jesus says, I did not come to be served, but to serve, and I would give my life, again, giving over my life as a ransom for many. And then here we see in light of Tekoa, the nobles would stay back, and they would not do any of the burdenous labor. And then it says there in verse 6, and moreover, Jehoiada, the son of Pasiah, and Meshulam, the son of Besodiah, repaired the old gate. And the old gate is another name or designation for the corner gate. We find this in 2 Kings 14:13 and Jeremiah 31:38. And it says there, they laid its beams, they hung its doors, and its bolts, and its bars. And why is this so important? Because very much the gates were seen as the front line of defense. You had to make sure that you had the bolts and the bars in, and that the doors and the beams were hung properly. Otherwise, the enemy could come in the siege mount and just tear down the doors. And it says there in verse 7, and next to them was Melatiah the Gibeonite, Jadon the Meronothite, and the men of Gibeon and the Mizpah. Now these two cities would have been north of Jerusalem. And what's interesting is if they would have been north of Jerusalem, they probably would have used the fish gate as their access. And the reason I find that so interesting, and what we know about these cities and the fish gate, it would have been near the Tower of Hanel. But what's cool about this is Nehemiah would assign them an area that they would frequently use within the city. Again, these weren't arbitrary assignments. You know, it'd be like me if the city came over and said, you know, we need to now give out and dispense to every resident an area of road to work on. Chances are I'd probably get assigned transit because I'm very much close to the corner South St. Mary's and Transit. Again, it would be, just sort of a common sense type of designation. You're close to that main vein, so we want you to work there. And that's sort of what Nehemiah did. Again, these men would use the northern gates to access the city, so it would become their responsibility, right? Their responsibility. Makes sense. And then it says there, they repaired the residence of the governor of the region beyond the river. Again, this would have been some type of steward who would have been governing this area, and they were also tasked this specific residence. And then it says there in verse 8, and next to him, Uzziel, the son of Harhaiah, one of the goldsmiths, made repairs. Now, what's interesting about that word goldsmith is it actually speaks to a trade. It was more of a guild or a union. They had unionized labor back then. I find that so interesting. We always blame the mafia for unions today, but it started way back then. And it says, and also next to him, Hananiah, one of the perfumers. Right? It says that they would make repairs as well. Now, what's interesting about the perfume manufacturers, and this would have been a booming and lucrative industry. What they've done is they would make these precious oils out of balsam. But what I love here is they are now given this new line of work by Nehemiah. Again, for us, it would be an exhortation that when God calls us to do something out of the norm or maybe out of our area of expertise, like the perfumers, we need to be open, we need to be flexible, and we need to be willing. Because they could have said, well, I'll just go around and spritz people. Right? Like the dude at the mall. Hey, can you turn on the AC? Zoe? It got hot. And then it says there, they fortified or they restored Jerusalem as far as the broad wall. Now the interesting thing, thank you, the interesting thing about the broad wall is it was this wall that no longer exists, but it would run between sort of the former wall and the current wall that actually exists today. But the reason they call it the broad wall is that there were sections of the walls that were actually 22 foot thick. Imagine having to repair that. And it says in verse 9, and then next to them was Rephaiah. Now the interesting thing about the son of Hur here is that his name means Yahweh has healed. And it says there that he was a leader of half the district of Jerusalem, and he made repairs. Now what we see here is he would be sort of this co-leader. But what I liked about him is he's this exemplary example. And then it says, and next to them, Jedaiah, the son of Harumph, which means flat nose. I don't know why this guy gets that. It's like, one guy's like, oh, you were healed of the Lord. And the other guy's like, you're spiky hair. Right? Like, we've recently come up with a nickname for Ruby. We call her Small Face. Because all her little features they're so close. They're like, hey, Small Face. And it says that they made repairs in front of his house. Now, what I love about this is we see that there must have been some type of extreme desolation with his own house. But here Nehemiah would sign something that would give this man great urgency and therefore, or great motivation and therefore the spirit of urgency. Again, Nehemiah is like understanding the significance of this landmark, and he would assign it to the owner because they would be motivated. Again, if he did not get his house built and did not get his house in order, he would have been vulnerable and susceptible to attacks. Again, great motivation. And what I love about that is a lot of times God asks us when he calls us to be faithful in his work, he'll tell us, start at your own house. Start at your own house. Again, a term that I adopted in drug rehab was, man, keep your own yard clean. Don't be checking out your neighbors. Just focus on your own yard, Tim. And I couldn't. Man, that was overwhelming to me. It was just my own yard, and I had like a little patch, right? But that was where I was at, and we can see a lesson there again. His own house, and then it says next to him was Hattush, the son of Hashabniah, and he made repairs. And then it says in verse 11, Malchijah, the son of Harim, and what's interesting about his name was it means Yahweh has considered. Yahweh has considered. Now I wonder if this was a man known for his petitions. Was this a man who would have an obvious grace upon him that people would say, man, God's hand is upon him. For some reason he's given this name. And then Hashab, the son of Pahath, Moab repaired another section, as well as the Tower of Ovens. Now that word ovens there means furnaces, but what's interesting about the towers is that we would see that many towers or other towers would have been built by Uzziah in 2 Chronicles 26. Now to sort of give us some understanding, well, what does that mean for us? Essentially, this would have been a common landmark of the land. Again, one of the things for me that earmarks the Midwest is all of our water towers. Because you don't have those in LA, or at least you don't see them. But it's like you always know when you're creeping up on a little town because you can see the water tower from the highway, right? Again, a very common sight there in Jerusalem, just like here. I know when I'm driving down the 29, I either see a water tower or I see a grain elevator. Very similar to kind of give us an understanding why these things would be so important. Now, if I was back in California, I have no idea what I would use as an example, but towers are just like water towers. And then it says in verse 12, and then next to him, and check this out, this is very interesting, was Shallum, the son of Hal-o-Hesh. And he too, like the other dude we just mentioned in verse 9, was a co-leader of half the district of Jerusalem. And it says there, and he and his daughters made repairs. These are the only gals mentioned in this entire list who were laborers within the building of the walls. But what's interesting is his father's name. Again, he's the son of Hal-o-Hesh. Now, Hal-o-Hesh would not have been a proper name. It would have been more like a nickname. And it means whisperer, snake charmer, or enchanter. Essentially, this would have been a family, and this is what it implies, and this is my notes. This would have been a family of carnies. You familiar with that term? Right? They would have worked in like the carnival trade. Again, these were real people God called through Nehemiah to do the work. That's what's neat. Imagine if the Lord now, as He looks to build this, and I don't want to call it Calvary Chapel. I want to give it a designation that's proper. I mean, the house of the Lord. A place where we can be discipled and trained for the work of the ministry. Imagine if the Holy Spirit was to inspire a scribe right now and was to pin all of our names in this room. And then some other pastor years down the road would be reading, and imagine the designations of the Spirit would inspire the scribe to write them down. Right? Yeah. All of a sudden now the names aren't so embarrassing, are they? I love that. And then it says there, verse 13, and then Hanam, the inhabitants of Noah, repaired the valley gate. And what's interesting about the valley gate, if we go back to chapter 2, this is where Nehemiah began his inspection. This was the starting point. And they built it, they hung its doors, its bolts, its bars, and they repaired 1,000 cubits of the wall as far as the refuse gates, which would have been, again, the city landfill, the dump gate. But we see here that these men were given an extremely long section of wall. Again, a cubit equals 18 inches, so this would have been about 1,500 feet of wall that these men would have had to have repaired. Now, here's the challenge with commentators. As I read through the commentators, they would say, oh, it's because this area of wall wasn't that badly damaged. Again, sort of minimizing the work that these guys did. That's why commentators, I'm always kind of cautious about them. But either way, they were given this, they were steward to this extensive area. And then Malchijah, the son of Rechab, which speaks to the Rechabites, the leader of the district of Beth Hasirim. Again, this would mean the house of the vineyard. This would have been a former resident district governor. It says they repaired the refuse gate. He built it, hung its doors, its bolts, and its bars. Verse 15, and then Shallum, the son of Hosea, which is interesting because it means everyone is a seer. Apparently, his family must have practiced divination. He was the leader of the district of Mizpah, and he repaired the fountain gate again. This would have been the gate that faced the En-Rogel spring. And it says there, he built it, covered it, hung its doors with its bolts and its bars, and repaired the wall of the pool of Shelah, which is most likely the pool of Siloam. We know in John chapter 9. Might be John chapter 8. I'm trying to remember right now. I'm trying to quickly go through 8 or 9. by the king's garden, and this would have most likely been Zedekiah, again, Judah's last king. It would have been his garden. And then it says, as far as the stairs that go down from the city of David. Now, when I think of these stairs, it would look like some type of escape. We're not going to get through it tonight. Or some type of exit. But here's what's interesting. This is one of the few archaeological finds that have been found today. Most of the stuff we're reading about, they have not been discovered. But these stairs that leave the city of David have been discovered. Very interesting. And then a couple more. I'd like to end after verse 17. And then it says there, and after him was Nehemiah, another Nemo, the son of Azbuk, again, the leader of half the district of Beth Zur, and he made repairs as far as the place in front of the tombs of David. Again, this would have been where all of the descendants, specifically the kings, were buried, to the man-made pool, as far as the house of the mighty. Again, most likely this was referring to David's mighty men. We find them in 2 Samuel 23 and then in 1 Samuel chapter 30. But what most think is this is probably some type of military barracks. And they had to repair it. And it's interesting because why would you want to repair the barracks except for the thought of imminent threat? Why would you have to prepare militarily unless you thought you were going to be attacked? And then the last verse for tonight, verse 17. And I thought about these guys a lot today. And then we'll finish next week. But it says, after him, the Levites. Now, what's interesting about the Levites, it says they're under Rehum, the son of Bani, made repairs. So apparently, this man Rehum would have been some type of tribal leader or some type of military leader. But what we know about the Levites was these were God's servants. These were the ones who were tasked by a genealogy to look over the things of the temple. So even those who just were cruising in the ministry had to get involved. And then it says, and next to him was Hashabiah, again the leader of half the district of Keilah. He made repairs of his district. And when we move on next week, we're going to find some neat things about that particular area. In fact, we're going to be introduced to some more priests. And then we're also going to be introduced to, and let me find their names. I found this very interesting as I was studying again today. Oh, verse 26. The Nethinim. These were the temple slaves. These were the slaves. So even slaves got involved in the work today. But here's what I want to leave with tonight as we get ready to pray. Is everyone did their share. Again, we see from the high priest to the tradesmen, such as the goldsmiths and the perfumers. We even see the involvement of our daughters. Again, the women's ministry showed up. We also see through the representation of the Kohites that even the commoners got involved. And of course, we're going to see the Nethinim later on next week, even the slaves. But what we need to see from this as we step into a time of prayer, that all of this is a result of passion and vision. Again, the one thing that Pastor Wall drilled in all of us, especially the staffers, is do you have passion and do you have vision? Do you have passion and do you have vision? And I remember sitting there, listening to that exhortation, and maybe like myself, you're sitting there thinking, well, I have one of the two. Man, I got oodles of passion. And I think even today my vision is being developed. But in order to do a work that God did through Nehemiah and through these commoners, again, people who even in biblical history are still unknown, but would use them to do such a great work that it would impact the nation even till today. We